Good day, everyone. This is Art News Live, and I'm Sarah, your reporter for today. Today's feature takes us into a world where creativity has no limits, where art is no longer seen but also experienced. We explore contemporary art, a movement shaped by ideas, society, and constant change, emerging from the bold and revolutionary period of modern art. In this report, we will define contemporary art, explore its key movements, recognize influential artists, and understand how art reflects the world we live in. So stay with us as we uncover how art continues to evolve and challenge the way we see reality.
Contemporary, a word we hear almost every day. It simply means the presence, the now. But when we connect it to art, it suddenly becomes complicated. Why? Because not everyone agrees on what now really means. In fact, even museums have different interpretations. For example, the Institute of Contemporary Art in London considers art from 1947 onward as contemporary, while the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York sets it starting at 1977. So which one is correct? The truth is, there is no single answers. This is why defining contemporary art is not as simple as it seems. Another common misconception is that modern and contemporary art are the same. But in art history, they are different periods. Modern art developed from the 1860s to the late 1970s, while contemporary art began in the 1970s up to the present. Modern art focused on breaking traditions. Artists rejected strict rules and explored new styles, materials, and techniques. This was influenced by major change like industrialization, new technology, urbanization, and the rise of commercial culture. It was a time of freedom, often described as anything goes. But in the 1970s, a major shift happened. First, postmodernism emerged, challenging the ideas of modern art. And second, clearly defined art movements started to decline. Because of these changes, contemporary art became more diverse, open, and evolving. It is no longer defined by one style, but by ideas, meaning, and the realities of today.
Now that we understand what contemporary art is, let's look at how it developed through society and history. Sarah, take it away. Between modern and contemporary art, there was a period shaped by major social, political, and cultural changes. These changes pushed artists to create not just for beauty, but to question society and its values. Because of this, art was no longer defined by style or techniques alone. Instead, artists focused on themes and issues, what they wanted to say, rather than how it looked. Art also became more global. It was no longer limited to one place or culture, but became a conversation shared across the world. As one idea suggests, in a world where nothing is fixed or original anymore, art responds to many issues, and not all of them are meant to be solved. This period also marked a big change in how art was created. Contemporary art became driven by ideas and concepts, and artists began using new forms like television, photography, cinema, digital technology, and performance, and even everyday objects. Because of this, the idea became more important than the final image. To understand this shift, we looked at the movements that bridge contemporary art and modern art. Now, first is abstract expressionism. It focused on emotion and spontaneity, often expressing the subconscious. Artists like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and William de Kooning created powerful abstract works. And it had two main styles, which is the action painting, which focused on movements and process, color fields, focused on the emotional power of color. And then next, we have the op art, or also known as the optical art, from the 1960s. This movement created visual illusions, making flat surfaces appear to move or have depth. Artists like Victor Vasarely and Bridget Riley used patterns and colors to trick the eye. Then came the kinetic art, which introduced actual movement. These artworks used wind, machines, or motion to come alive. And then artists like Alexander Calder created moving sculptures called mobiles. In Japan, there's a unique movement called Gutai, emerged from the 1950s to 1970s, and it focused on the connection between the body, movement, and materials. Artists didn't just paint, they performed. For example, Kazuo Shiraga used his body to create art by moving through mud. And then this movement combined performance, painting, and installation, pushing the boundaries of what art could be. All these movements show how art was slowly changing from focusing on form and technique to focusing on ideas, experience, and meaning. And this transition leads us fully into contemporary art. With these movements bringing the gap, new styles began to emerge. Catherine will now discuss two of the most influential, minimalism and pop art.
Another important movement that helped shape contemporary art is minimalism. Minimalism began in the early 1960s in New York. It focused on simplicity and objectivity, reducing artworks to their most basic elements. Artists used geometric shapes, simple forms, and industrial materials. They avoided emotional expressions and symbolism. Instead, they emphasized the material itself, meaning what you see is exactly what it is. Minimalist art is often described as cool, clean, and simple, rather than dramatic or expressive. Some key artists of minimalism include Agnes Martin, Robert Morris, Sol LeWitt, Dan Flavin, Carl Andre, and Donald Judd. On the other hand, we have a more colorful and relatable movement, which is pop art. Pop art started in 1950s and became popular in 1960s. It was inspired by a mass media and commercial culture. This includes advertisements, comic books, product packaging, and movies, and pop music. Instead of separating art from daily life, pop art made art more relatable and familiar. It also aimed to break the boundary between high art and low art. According to Richard Hamilton, pop art is popular, transient, expendable, low-cost, mass-produced, youth-oriented, witty, and glamorous. However, pop art also faced criticism. Some believed that it used ordinary or low objects. It lacked depth or seriousness and sometimes felt detached from real life. Despite this, pop art became one of the most recognizable movements. Some key artists include Andy Warhol, James Rosenquist, Claes Oldenburg, Tom Wesselmann, Ed Ruska, and Roy Lichtenstein. From the simplicity of minimalism to the bold and everyday visual of pop art, these movements show how art continued to evolve, becoming more diverse, expressive, and connected to real life.
As art continued to evolve, artists began to challenge even deeper ideas. Valin will now introduce postmodernism.
So, what is postmodernism? It is not just an art style, it is a major shift in how people see the world. Postmodernism emerged in the 1960s and was formally named around the 1970s. It broke away from the strict rules of modernism instead of searching for one perfect truth. It accepted that there can be many truths. In postmodernism, there is no single right way to create art. In fact, any goes. Artists become free to be humorous, controversial, or even intentionally imperfect, all just to challenge traditional ideas. Postmodernism is built on several core beliefs. First, the skepticism. It questioned grand narratives or the idea that there is only one truth. Second, the freedom. Artists are not limited by rules, styles, or expectations. Third, borrowing ideas. Instead of being completely original, artists remix, copy, and transform existing styles. And lastly, there is no fixed goal in art. Art doesn't need to be perfect, and progress is not always seen as something positive. One of the biggest changes in postmodernism is the role of the viewer. Before, people believed that the meaning of art came only from the artist, but postmodernism changed that. Now, the meaning depends on you, the viewer. Your interpretation, your experience become part of the artwork itself. Because of this, postmodernism became like big umbrella, covering many different art movements. These include conceptual art, installation art, performance art, feminist art, minimalism art, and video art. So instead of asking, what is the correct meaning of this artwork? Postmodernism asks, what does it mean to you?
With boundaries becoming less defined, art entered a more experimental phase. Junbert will now explore contemporary movements.
Now that we understand postmodernism, let's look at contemporary art itself. In this period, art movement no longer followed strict boundaries. Instead, they began to overlap. Different styles, ideas, and techniques were mixed together, creating a complex and sometimes disordered art world. One major development in contemporary art was the move away from traditional forms like painting and sculpture. Artists began exploring experimental formats such as film, photography, video, performance, installation, site-specific works, and even art. These forms often combine with each other, creating a new technique, ways of expressing ideas. Compared to early period, contemporary art is considered the most socially aware. It focuses on real-life issues, many of which are controversial, emotional, and relevant today. One example is neo-pop art, which started in the 1980s. It was inspired by artists like Andy Warhol. Like pop art, it uses images from celebrities, advertisement, and everyday objects. But it often adds criticism and deeper meaning about society. Another movement is photorealism. In this style, artists create artworks that looks almost exactly like photographs. They focus on extreme detail and precision, making it hard to tell if it's a painting or a real photo. Next is conceptualism or conceptual art. In this movement, the idea is more important than the appearance. This message behind the art matters more than how it looks. Lastly, we have performance art. Here, the artist doesn't just create an object. The action itself becomes the artwork. It can be live or recorded, planned or spontaneous, and sometimes the audience even become part of the experience. All of these movements show that contemporary art is no longer limited. It is dynamic, experimental, and deeply connected to society.
As art expanded into new forms and spaces, it became more interactive and visible in everyday life. Creslyn will now present these forms. Now let's explore some of the most immersive and interactive form of contemporary art. First, we have installation art. This is a type of art that transforms a space or environment instead of just looking at the artwork, and the viewer can actually enter and experience it. It is usually large scale, uses different materials like object, light, and sound, often site-specific, and sometimes temporary. Some of the well-known installation artists include Alan Capro, Yayoi Kusama, and Dale Chihuly. One of the famous examples of public installation art is the Cadillac Ranch. It features 10 Cadillac cars from the 1949 to 1964, buried nose first into the ground in a straight line in Texas. What makes it unique is that the visitors can interact with it by adding graffiti or repainting the cars. Next we have is earth art, also known as land art or earthworks. This movement uses the natural landscapes, as the medium. Artists create artworks directly on the land using materials like rocks, soil, and plants. Instead of focusing on objects, they focus on shaping and transforming the environment itself. Some well-known earth artists include Robert Smithson, Christo, Richard Long, Andy Goldsworthy, and Jean-Claude. Lastly, we have street art. This is art created in public place, often without permission. It also known as independent art, post-graffiti, or guerrilla art. Street art includes murals, stencils, and stickers, and public installations. It is usually unsanctioned, but it reaches a wide audience because it exists in everyday spaces. Some famous street artists include Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, Shepard Fairey, and Banksy. As these forms shows that contemporary art is no longer limited to galleries or museums, it exists in spaces we can walk into, in nature, and even in the streets we pass by every day. From ideas to experiences to our real-world issues, contemporary art continues to evolve, reflecting who we are as a society. From tradition to transformation, art has continuously evolved alongside society, shaping ideas, challenging norms, and reflecting the realities of our time. This has been Art News Live. I'm Sarah, reminding you that art is not just something we see, it's something we experience, question, and live. Thank you.